Thank you, everyone. Welcome back. We resume our session. Today, Dr. Miguel Farias from Oxford University will be addressing us on the topic brain, religion, and irreligion. Let me also enable summary for this one. Okay, thank you, everyone. Welcome back. Today, Dr. Miguel Farias will be addressing us from the neuroscientific perspective on neuroscience, brain science, and religious belief. Let me introduce Dr. Mike for you. His research expertise is on the science of meditation and in the interaction between cognitive, behavioral, and biological dimensions of spiritual practices and experiences. He studied psychology and cognitive behavior therapy at the University of Lisbon, followed by a PhD in experimental psychology at Oxford University and master's in the study of religion and religious experience at the University of Wales. He has been postdoctoral researcher at Cambridge University and Oxford University, and a lecturer in experimental psychology at Oxford University. He has been a principal investigator or co-principal investigator in 16 research grants, and his work has been extensively reported across international newspapers and magazines, radio and television documentaries. He has written for New Scientist, Spectator, and the BBC. His book, The Buddha Pill, Can Meditation Change You?, with Catherine Wickham, has been translated into various languages. In 2017, Miguel won the William Baer Award given by the American Psychological Association, Division 36, for his contribution to the psychological study of spirituality. His most recent book is the Oxford Handbook of Meditation. We are indeed privileged to be listening to Dr. Mike today. All the more, friends, I must say, I have a long-standing relationship and interaction with Dr. Mike. He is my mentor in Oxford for my own research in the cognitive and neurological aspects of atheism. And the irony of the session today is that Dr. Mike is in my office in Kerala, India, and I am here in Oxford under his guidance. That is the scenario today. So, most welcome to all of you. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Augustine. It is indeed a special delight to be talking to you today from Dr. Augustine's office at the Little Flower Seminary, surrounded by the library on science and religion. As he was saying, I am an experimental psychologist who works on religion, and I have also done some work using neuroscientific methods. So today, I would like to share with you two studies which I undertook with various colleagues from philosophy and neuroscience, in which we are looking at the correlates of religious belief and how to potentially change these beliefs. So I will start to share my slides with you. Just check if this is okay. Yes.
Fine, Mike. Perhaps you can make it. Now it is full screen. Very good.
Is it? Okay. Excellent. So as I was saying, I'll be covering two studies. One has to do with religious belief and the other with the neuromodulation of religious belief, and I'll explain what that means later. So You will all be familiar with our good old friend Richard Dawkins, and you may be familiar with this particular video from the Horizon documentary series, which was aired in 2003, so 20 years ago. And this episode focused on the God helmet. You possibly will be familiar with this idea. So this was developed by Michael Persinger, a neuroscientist from Canada. And from it gave rise to this neurotheology idea, in the sense that religious experience and belief might be stimulated by a particular area of the limbic system of the brain. So if you haven't watched this, you can watch this episode online. It's very, very humorous, because they're trying this form of brain stimulation. This is before more advanced and focused forms of brain stimulation were started, such as transcranial magnetic stimulation or transcranial direct current stimulation. The difference between these two techniques is that one uses a magnetic pulse and the other uses electricity. So you will find this enjoyable, and I will not tell you the punchline, whether Persinger were able or not to stimulate a religious experience in Richard Dawkins through this neural stimulation device, but I think it's quite obvious what the answer is. Now, in 2004, a colleague of mine, a Swedish colleague of mine, actually tried to replicate Persinger's research, but instead of doing real brain stimulation, they did a pseudo brain stimulation. By comparing these groups, they realized that they didn't get any of these effects except by suggestibility. And there was a long public correspondence between Persinger and Per Grönqvist, which ended in a bad, sour note. But since then, I mean, no one has taken much seriously Persinger's work. But what Persinger's work has been suggesting, and he's not the only one, Ramachandran's work on epilepsy and religious experience is similarly suggesting that. They're suggesting that religious experiences are processed by regions which process lower order cognition and feelings. So one of the questions, or the key question, which I tried to understand is, can we make out a study in which we understand what particular areas of the brain process religious belief and experience, and whether these areas are usually associated with lower or higher cognition? So at the time, I was working in the Oxford Center for Science of the Mind, which was tackling two questions: how are belief systems instantiated in the brain? Perhaps unsurprisingly, we didn't get very far with this question. The second question, however, how do belief systems influence states of consciousness? We do manage to get to somewhere. Just to share with you some of the bad publicity we got on this project. This was published in the Times. Believers go on wreck to prove God relieves pain. And the headline said, people are to be tortured in laboratories at Oxford University in a United States funded experiment to determine whether belief in God is effective in relieving pain. So in a nutshell, this was the project which I was responsible for, together with a philosopher and a neuroscientist colleague. What we were interested in studying was whether religious beliefs could have an indirect or direct influence on the experience of pain. And most of you who have a strong theological background would be aware that across religious traditions, there are various understandings of pain. So we have the case of the mystic Saint Catherine of Siena in her dialogue in Jesus, where it's very, very clear that the willingness and the desire to suffer for the salvation of souls is something which is real and looked forward in one's spiritual exercise of becoming closer to Jesus. However, if we move to the Hindu philosophical tradition, so here we have the great exponent of Advaita Vedanta, non-dualistic Hindu philosophy, where he says that pain cannot exist as a quality of the innermost self, which is pure consciousness. So within pure consciousness, there is no experience of pain. Therefore, this is just an illusion, an illusory experience. Now, what we know from decades of work on pain, both acute and chronic pain, is that pain does involve a sensorial element, right? So we do have the ability in terms of nerve receptors to be sensitive to pain, and this plays an important role in our survival. However, pain also has an affective component. So if you are more anxious or feel hopeless, the threshold of pain would lower. You'd feel more pain. There's also a cognitive element of pain to do with attention, appraisal, how you interpret pain, the beliefs you might have about the ability to control pain. And last but not least, there is also a cultural element. So there's a differential tolerance of pain depending on culture. By the time I started this study, there was practically no literature on religion and pain, with one or two exceptions. This is one of the exceptions. An electroencephalographic study of advanced yogis, where they tested 4 yogis, and 2 of them were able to keep their hands in very cold water for a very long time without reporting any changes in EEG activity. This is actually, so the reason why I'm here in Kerala today is because we are conducting a large study on the effects of religious meditation, both Christian and Islamic. And this is precisely one of the tasks we are using. Just today, I was trying out putting my hand in cold water, not at 4, but 5 degrees. And lo and behold, I couldn't hold my hand at 5 degrees for more than 30 seconds. It was just very, very painful. So it's difficult to think how you can hold your hand at this icy temperature without reporting any EEG changes. What we suppose happen is that through their yoga experience, they're able to completely shut off their ability to sense pain. Now, how might this happen within various traditions? Although there is a possibility that belief might have a direct influence on pain, it's much more likely that there will be what we can call an indirect modulation, or even a subpersonal modulation. So by indirect modulation, what we hypothesize is that once you are thinking about your beliefs, so for example, you're doing a religious contemplation of either Krishna or of Jesus, this will lead to a focused attention on the religious object, and this will change your mood, your effects, towards a more positive mood and effect, and this will then have an indirect modulatory effect on pain. At a subpersonal level, it might be that religious experience will activate endogenous pathways of opioids or endorphins, also called endorphins. So, for example, my own lab has conducted studies on the effects of rituals on one's biology. And it's very clear that religious rituals are activating these endogenous endorphins. So that we know will also have an effect on pain. Right. So for this particular study, where we are looking at the effects of religious belief on pain perception, we had what we generally call a 2-by-2 design. What does this mean? This means that we are comparing two groups of people and we are stimulating two different states in these people. So first, the first factor is group. So we wanted to compare religious versus non-religious participants. So for our first group, we had practicing Catholics, and for our non-religious group, we were testing atheists and agnostics. Now, the second factor is state of consciousness. And by this, I will mean religious stimulation. So what we did after months of trying out different things, so we thought about using a quote from the Psalms or from the New Testament. The problem is that you have to find a control condition for this. And it's very difficult to find a controlled secular condition for a relevant quotation from the Old or New Testament. So we ended up using a religious image, specifically an image of the Virgin Mary. The reason why we used an image of the Virgin Mary and not of Christ is because if we had used an image of Christ, given what we know of the Passion and the suffering of Christ in the Passion, this might actually be a confounding factor, as participants contemplating the image of Christ might be reminded of his suffering, and this might actually lead to higher levels of pain perception. So by choosing an image of the Virgin Mary, we were also faced with the problem that this might alienate people who are not from a Roman Catholic or an Orthodox tradition. So we ended up only using Roman Catholics. Now, the way we assessed whether our religious stimulation was working was to ask people, after looking at the images, if they had felt emotionally moved by the images and how affected their state of mind had been by it. And we used this on a slider scale, as in the line below. We also asked if the picture induced in them thoughts or feelings of a religious or spiritual nature. So our two stimuli or images were an image of the Virgin Mary, the one you see below, from the painter Sassoferrato, and we found another image from the same time period by Leonardo da Vinci, which is the famous Lady with Ermine. So imagine those of you who have been in a brain imaging scanner, so you think of that very narrow tube and very loud noise. You put people in there and you ask them to focus on the image that they are being shown. And they are either shown the religious or non-religious image, and the experiment takes place for about 1 hour. So they're shown successively either the religious or the non-religious image. So, but they focus in one image at a time for 30 seconds. After 30 seconds, the image keeps being shown, but they are given electric shocks at the back of their hand. So that's why you see those red waves down there in the graph. So those are 10 seconds of electric shock, and we calibrated this electric shock to be quite painful. We calibrated for them to rate it an 8 out of a possible 10, where 10 is unbearably painful. So 8 is quite painful. After the painful stimulation, there were 2 ratings. we asked them to rate the intensity of the pain they felt and how much they had been affected by the image, either the religious or non-religious image. And then all this was repeated various times. So, because this is an fMRI experiment, you usually have a much lower number of participants than a questionnaire study. So we used 12 participants per group, which is the norm. Now, so I'm showing you now some of the results. So the score results, not yet the brain imaging, the neural correlates. So in terms of pain intensity, so let's start with the upper left-hand side. So this is the graph for pain intensity for the religious believers, so for the Catholics. And it shows that when they were looking at the religious image, their level of pain intensity was significantly lower than when looking at the non-religious image, which is what we had expected. And the graph on the right-hand side has to do with how affected they were by the image. And also, as expected, they overall and more significantly rated as being more affected by the image of the Virgin Mary than the Lady with Ermine. Now, our group of atheists, for them, in terms of pain intensity, there was no difference whether they were looking at the religious or non-religious image. However, they said that they were more deeply affected by the secular image, which again is what we would expect, because atheists would have a normal sense of displeasure at a religious image. So, and we also asked them about how the religious and the secular image had helped them to cope with the pain. So we have here the ratings for believers and atheists, and we see that for the secular image, there is no difference in terms of how helpful they found the image between atheists and religious people. However, the religious people found the Virgin Mary image much more helpful in coping with the pain than the atheists did, which is what we would expect. Now, what is our hypothesis in terms of neural activation? So we were basing ourselves on previous research on the activation of the anterolateral prefrontal cortex. There had been papers published on the role of this right anterior lateral prefrontal cortex, showing that when people were successful in coping with anxiety and were able to detach themselves from the pain, or when the pain was perceived as controllable, you had a higher activation of this area of the brain. This led us to hypothesize that when religious people were being subjected to pain and looking at the religious image, we would see an activation of this area being associated with a decrease in pain. And that is exactly what we found. So we found that when the religious believers are being stimulated with pain and watching the religious image, there was a higher activation of the anterolateral prefrontal cortex. We also found another point, another region of the brain, which was particularly associated with the experience of watching the religious image for the religious group, which is the ventral midbrain. And we know from other studies that the ventral midbrain is an area which is associated when you like, in a particular positive way, a certain stimulus, which makes sense because they were looking at a pleasant image which was deeply significant for them. Right. We also interviewed all of these participants after the experiment, and one of the questions we asked was, how did you feel emotionally moved by the picture when you were being subjected to pain? And they reported that they were feeling safe, protected by the Virgin Mary. They were feeling calm, peaceful, compassionate. They were feeling serene, being taken care of. And this religious image inspired in them thoughts and feelings of a religious nature. So, for example, one participant said, it reminded me that I can pray so that it doesn't hurt. So when the image flickered, the flickering happened when the pain stimulus started. When the image flickered, I prayed. Another participant said that she was saying Hail Marys when being subjected to pain and looking at the image of the Virgin Mary. Others said that they felt like they were at church, and others said that they were thinking of previous religious experiences. I remember another one whom I interviewed, a very interesting interview, who said that I just kept thinking that all things will be well in the end. Right. So, in relation to my first question, which was, is religious belief and experience processed by lower level cognition that has to do with the limbic system, as people like Persinger or Ramachandran claim, or does it have to do with high level processing? So in this experiment, it's very clear that religious belief is being processed with a higher level neural network. So these particular two areas are associated with this higher level or higher order cognitive processing. So this shows that religious belief is actually not something associated with lower order brain activity like the limbic system, but with a higher order cognitive system. Okay. I will stop there before moving on to the next part of my talk and just check if you have any questions about this particular study. You can also keep your questions to the end. It's completely up to you if you don't want to ask your questions now, but I would just like to give you a chance if you'd like any clarification on this particular study.
So friends, we can have a short interaction now. You can put your questions in the chat box or come up with you can ask them directly to Mike. Maybe to set the ball rolling, Mike, I was wondering, you nearly 15 years since you conducted this research. What was the response of the atheistic groups to your findings? Have they accepted it, or are they comfortable with it, or how they come up with the objections? I will be a bit curious to know about
well,
that.
that's an excellent question. So what happened is that I felt while interviewing the atheists that the experiment did not come up with a good enough stimulation for the atheists. That, in other words, while we were very careful to find a stimulus which was deeply meaningful for the religious group, for the atheist group, we only found an image which was aesthetically pleasing, but not deeply pleasing. And this led me and one of the philosophers I worked with to create a questionnaire on the kinds of beliefs that atheists might have. And this eventually led us to do a study on atheists and agnostics who believe in science. And there's now various studies showing that for atheists, for atheists in certain cultural contexts, such as in Britain, believing in science might be a replacement for believing in religion. So that we have studies, for example, showing that when highly stressed or highly anxious, these atheists would cling on, would heighten their belief in science in ways similar to people who are religious believers. So this project actually sparked a whole different line of investigation on what atheists might believe in and how their beliefs might also help them in coping with adversities. Yes, and we have a hand up. Ferdinand.
Now, we have these things we call vocations in the Catholic Church, whereby one is called into a ministry and he or she can join a congregation which has the same charism that God has called him or her to do. you will find that sometimes when Jesus or maybe when God is calling somebody, it may be difficult even for the religious people to understand. And I take my example. In 1995, I had a very wonderful experience which no priest was able to discern and to support me. But later on, when I went to the Jesuits, where Professor Jerry Whelan is a professor in Rome now, he took time, he listened to what I claimed to be as a calling. He took me through the journey of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And believe me not, what I experienced during the spiritual exercises in 1998 is the same experience I feel today. It's a life journey. So you find that there are people who have the desire to to follow Christ. There are those whom God actually puts on the journey. So as you are presenting it, I am really happy because I'm now finding the true and real meaning of my vocation, which for the last almost 20 years, I live bearing testimony and witness. But it was a calling not to be married,
Wonderful.
but to be a follower of Jesus in a special way, following my mission, vision as a servant. My calling actually is among the sick, the trouble-hearted, the people who lose hope in life. And that's now, as you are presenting, I'm finding the position where I am. There's actually, when God called me, St. Ignatius of Loyola actually took the mantle now to ignite, to stimulate my brain, to make sure that the calling was a calling, and this is what God is calling me to. So religious experiences are best sometimes, the way you are saying, they actually give people that morale. You see images, like we are told that in the Catholic Church, we use images, we use those images, they are not actually allowed in Christianity. No. The image of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the image of Saint Joseph, the image of the apostles, the image of Christ crucified, give us that spiritual moment where you feel not only the pain, but also the joy and the journey you make with Jesus Christ. Jesus never just went to the cross. He made a life, a journey, and he's inviting us, take your cross and follow me. So if the cross can become something which is
Ferdinand,
imprinted
could you
in human
kindly
hearts,
wind up,
I'm
Ferdinand?
telling
Your
you,
reflections appreciated. Ferdinand, could you kindly conclude? And if you have any question, you can directly pause. I appreciate your comments very much. Kindly
so
wind up, Ferdinand.
what I conclude is that we need religious moments in our life to actually ignite, to stimulate our religious beliefs so that we move on.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
Ferdinand.
That's very, yes. I completely sympathize with what you're saying, and I'm really happy, and personally, for your wonderful experience and the ability to discern your vocation and mission. That's wonderful. But as you were also rightly pointing out, there's a very rich tradition in Christianity, also other religious traditions, of the use of images. So these images have been used for very long time to precisely to stimulate these deeper states of contemplation and of greater closeness to God. Similarly with what in the Hindu tradition you call mantras, there's also mantra-like prayers in Christianity, such as the heart prayer, so which is used both in the Catholic and Orthodox tradition. So thank you very much, Ferdinand, for that. Where are you based, Ferdinand? Where are you speaking from?
I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya.
In Kenya, Nairobi. Wonderful. I had a meeting with someone there yesterday. Wonderful.
Okay, thank you.
Right. So we will resume the Q&A later. I want now to tell you about a different study
There are a couple of questions in chat
Oh,
box.
there are a couple of
Related to
questions.
this
Okay,
thing, do you
okay. Go
see?
on, go on. I'm sorry. Go on. Go ahead, Augustine.
This is from Anju Abraham. Does your research have some suggestion that spirituality and aesthetics are closely related in the brain? Lady with Ermin, which is an aesthetic image, and Mother Mary, are they connected in the brain?
So beautiful or aesthetic images do cause a good impression. They are appreciated as something like good food. Let's say it. However, what we noticed in this study was that above the aesthetic component, the religious component of the image of the Virgin Mary played the key role on the down modulation of pain, so on the easing of pain, the lowering of pain, and of that particular neural correlate. So in that sense, we can say that the religious belief and experience here is playing an additional or different role from that of just an aesthetic experience. I hope that made sense. Yes, interesting
Okay.
question.
Okay, Mike. Next question from Robert Graff. Robert Graff is based in Washington, US. A similar
Yes,
question.
hello.
A similar question. Do you think that using an inspiring picture from nature, perhaps Grand Canyon, or a beautiful flower, or a field of flowers, would religious versus aesthetic people have a different response?
Very, very interesting and astute question. I am trying to think of a study that might have compared these. There are now quite a lot of studies on on experiences of awe, not religious necessarily, just experiences of awe before nature, like the Grand Canyon, or being in a particularly beautiful natural site. Now, whether an experience of awe in nature would be different for religious people, it would if it would bring about an activation of the belief. If that experience would be translated in terms of, for example, seeing not just a beautiful sight, but God's glory. I mean, to use a Christian image. So in that sense, a religious person could attribute religious meaning to that experience of awe. And we know from the I'm thinking now of the literature on meditation and contemplation, even within the Christian tradition. So I give lots of talks on meditation, and there are atheists who have these, deep experiences of seeing the world in a different light, but they do not have a meaning system, a religious meaning system that allows them to understand, to make meaning out of it. So they're struggling to find sense of that experience. However, if you are a religious person, such as in an experience of awe, you'd be able to attribute religious meaning both to a natural experience or to an experience of deep contemplation. So yes, I would agree with that.
Next from Christopher in Bangalore. Are our brains wired in a way that conditions us to develop emotions accordingly? Are our emotions also conditioned by our brain wiring? That is the question, Mike.
So yes, yes, but with a semicolon, in the sense that yes, it is part of our biological repertoire. So in the same way that we have the biological ability to develop a language, to learn a language or more, if you are stimulated by other people talking a language. But we can speak a language while chimpanzees cannot if they listen to us, because we have the biological, you can call it conditioning or wiring. right? So with emotions, let's say, yes, we do have the capacity, the neural ability or the neural scaffolding to perceive, to experience fear or affection or romantic desire, for example. My semicolon has to do with the universality of emotional expression, because there's well-known psychological work from the 1970s and 80s by Paul Ekman that suggests that there are basic facial emotional expressions, such as joy, fear, surprise, but more recent research has shown that actually these are not universally recognized. There's quite a lot of variation. So yes, we are able biologically and neurally to experience emotions, but the way these are interpreted or processed vary a lot according to culture.
Fine, Mike. I think that's all what we have for now. You can go ahead with the presentation, I think.
Excellent. So I would like now to move into something which I know is dear to our good friend Augustine, which is the cognitive science of religion. So one of the basic ideas coming from cognitive science of religion is that we were just talking about being wired, so having brain biological dispositions to experience certain characteristics of religious belief and experience. So the crux of cognitive science of religion is exactly that. We have the cognitive tools to see the world in certain ways, and it's these tools, which were developed by natural evolution, that are being misused or misapplied and gives rise to religion. Let me give you an example that John Hadley Brooke, whose work you would, I think, know, who's a major historian of science and religion. He was actually my boss when I was doing that project on brain imaging of religion and pain. So whenever I need something, I usually email him, and he comes up always with wonderful responses. So I asked him about the anthropomorphizing, which is a major thing in cognitive science of religion. And I asked John Brooke, do you know of any earlier reference, the last 100 or 200 years, of other authors who talk about our anthropomorphizing capacity? And of course, he tells me, yes, in The Descent of Man, Darwin comments on the behavior of his dog. So he says, Darwin is saying that one summer day, the dog was suddenly barking at a parasol which was swaying in the breeze. So Darwin thought that the dog must have risen to himself. That movement without any apparent cause indicated the presence of some strange living agent, and that no stranger had the right to be on his territory. So what Darwin is saying is that his dog was anthropomorphizing the winds, the breeze, moving, just touching the parasol and making it sway. So he saw in that an agent. And that's very much what key theories of cognitive science of religion are telling us. So for example, Stuart Guthrie's work, who's an anthropologist, is telling us how we are very good at seeing faces in the clouds or just seeing agents where there are none in nature. So Guthrie suggests that religion extends the way in which we attribute agents to non-humans. So we can think of non-human entities in human terms. So for example, we can think of the sea as angry or the moon as sad. And so Guthrie goes on to argue that our cognitive system infers supernatural agency through gods or spirits as a way of coping with the ambiguity and the unpredictability of the world. So this is really the reformulation of old anthropological ideas. And and early philosophical ideas. Justin Barrett, with whom I have also worked, and who is a developmental psychologist originally. So a developmental psychologist is someone who studies children's behavior and cognition. So he was very inspired by Stuart Guthrie, and he combines his insights with the growing cognitive science of the 1970s and 80s. And he developed his theory of the hyperactive agents detection device, which people like Richard Dawkins liked a lot. And the idea is very much the Stuart Guthrie's idea that we are able to see agents, invisible supernatural agents in the natural world just because we are very good at recognizing agents everywhere. So he's saying that this device, this mental device, the tendency of this mental hyperactivity device to attach agency to objects contributes to the formation of religious concepts. And he says that if we see something in the environment which is ambiguous, this might be recognized as a ghost or a spirit. So this device may then discover evidence that these figures don't just physically resemble humans, but are indeed thinking, feeling beings. Now, this is the main point that I want to get to. If the right information is fed to these mental tools, the outcome is a non-reflective belief in a ghost or a spirit. So he's saying that we come up with this non-reflective belief. We imagine this supernatural or non-physical agent because we have this device, and this is processed in a non-rational, non-reflective way. That is, in an intuitive way, in a kind of subconscious way. Now, what Justin Barrett is referring to is a large literature on cognitive psychology, which talks about two main forms of processing information in the environment. There are different names for this. It's often called, so Kahneman, for example, calls it the analytical versus intuitive system. Other people call it the rational versus the experiential system. But the gist of it is the same. The idea is that the rational or analytical system is the logical one, it's the conscious one, and it's a slow system. It requires effort, it requires reflection. On the other hand, the intuitive or the holistic system or the experiential system, it's very quick. So it happens at the subconscious level or pre-conscious level. And that's why it's usually called the intuitive system. And in terms of our human evolution, it's the system which has saved us, I mean, which has led us to be here today, talking about these things. Because if you are in a natural environment, you intuitively or preconsciously react to the potential presence of predators. Now, this literature led in about 12 years ago, it was in 2012 and 2013 that were various studies conducted which tried to do what Justin Barrett was talking about, but in a slightly different way. These studies try to associate the intuitive system, intuitive processing system, with religious belief, and the analytical or logical system with atheism. So this paper by my colleague Will Gervais, who's now in London, has a series of experiments in which he uses what we experimental psychologists call priming. Priming means this is a stimulus that will affect your cognition. So he either showed participants an image of this Greek athlete, or to other participants, an image of the famous sculpture of Rodin, the thinker. So you see someone in deep thought. It so happened that when you showed Rodin to people, this led people to have lower levels of religious belief in comparison with people who are watching, who are just contemplating the Greek athletes. And there were other studies showing similar results, that religious people generally tended to rely more on intuitive thinking, and religious beliefs tended to be associated with intuitive and not analytical thinking. I think probably the most interesting study, and I think the only neuroscience study on this, comes from, I don't have her name here, Lindemann. So the Finnish researcher, she's done a lot of work on religion and cognition. So this study, she came up with a cognitive task of supernatural thinking, and she gave it to both atheists and religious people. And she noticed that the atheists were better at suppressing the supernatural attribution, so the supernatural thinking. And when there was this suppression, this was correlated with the right inferior frontal gyrus. So in a nutshell, when people were able to suppress their supernatural attribution, seeing supernatural things, this led to a higher activation of the right inferior frontal gyrus. And this is interesting because other studies show that the right inferior frontal gyrus is associated with cognitive inhibition. So cognitive inhibition is our ability to suppress thoughts which are either irrelevant or unwanted. So this area of the brain allows us to block intuitive or belief-based, the belief-based system. Right. So I thought this is really interesting, but there's lots of things here which don't really make sense. If religion is natural and we are hardwired to believe, as cognitive science of religion claims, how can we explain atheism, for example, non-belief? So there's two possibilities. Either atheists do not have the propensity to believe in the supernatural, and if that is the case, then this puts in question the bulk of cognitive science of religion, which says that we are natural-born believers. We have these innate tendencies to see supernatural agency in the environment, or cognitive science of religion is right, and we do have this ability, but we are able to inhibit this tendency, as Lindemann's fMRI study, brain imaging study, is suggesting. So we did an experiment to test this. So our aim was to test if cognitive science of religion's ideas and Lindemann's also results were replicable. Now, instead of just doing a correlational study, all of these brain imaging studies that we're looking at with fMRI, they're correlational studies, which means that you're looking at how your results on a certain task are correlated with certain regions of the brain. What we wanted to do was to use a different experimental paradigm which allowed us to manipulate cognitive inhibition. So as I was saying at the beginning of the talk, in the last 20 years, there's been a development of techniques which allow us to manipulate, for some temporarily, areas of the brain. So you are able to either increase the activity of those areas of the brain or to decrease. For example, with this magnetic pulse, you're able to create what they call a virtual lesion in the brain. They call it a virtual lesion because it impairs the activity of that specific region of the brain for some time, right? It's just temporary. But this temporary virtual lesion allows us to see what are the effects of just inhibiting that area of the brain or stimulating it. So what we did was to use one of these techniques. We use the electric stimulation, so transcranial direct current stimulation, and we were aiming to manipulate cognitive inhibition, so to either increase cognitive inhibition or decrease cognitive inhibition. That means to either increase activity of the right inferior frontal gyrus or to decrease. So as I said, we used this technique of transcranial direct current stimulation, the right inferior frontal gyrus, and we did this using a double-blind trial. What does this envisage? What does this? How do we do this? We did this in one way. We randomly allocated people to different conditions, and neither the experimenter or the participants knew if they were being given a placebo stimulation or a real stimulation. And the randomization was done by a researcher which didn't meet the researchers directly. And then we measured how these different levels of manipulation were able to affect either implicit or explicit measures of supernatural belief. So this is an image of our lab, and the device we use is this one. So it's a small box, and you attach the two electrodes and to the area that you want to manipulate, right? Right. So I don't want to go into too much detail on the belief measures. So some of these are questionnaires. The most interesting one are these, what we call these implicit tasks, which means that they try to activate your intuitive responses to religious belief. And then very importantly, we also use the cognitive inhibition tests, which allows us to tell if people had higher levels of cognitive inhibition when we were increasing the stimulation of the right inferior frontal gyrus. So if we were able to see a difference in this task for people who were being stimulated, this would show that the stimulation was working. Right. So I want to show in particular the supernatural attribution task, which is the one that Lindemann had used in her brain imaging study. Now, this might sound a bit silly, and it is indeed very simplistic particularly for theologians. So what she did was she would present a little vignette. So a simple story like this one. After a terrible or gruesome romantic breakup, you are getting back together and you are afraid how the relationship will turn out. And then you are shown an image and you ask participants to rate if the image shows a sign of the universe for how this situation will develop. So in case of this vignette, we have this image. So does the image of two joined cherries gives a sign of the universe of how the breakup situation and the relationship will resolve? And people will rate to what an extent you feel that this is a sign that this is related to what will happen in your life. Yeah, so the picture contains, this is the rating scale we use. Does this picture contain a sign or a message about how the situation will turn out? I strongly disagree to I strongly agree. So if you strongly agree that the picture presents a message about how the situation will turn out, this would be classified as a high supernatural attribution. And these are just two other cases. So we had about 30 of these vignettes. Case A loved one has been arrested for drunk driving and you are afraid she will get a prison sentence. And then you see a wall. And then you're asked again, does this picture contain a message about how the situation will turn out? And another vignette, you have discovered a strange skin change on your arm, and you do not know what it is. And then you see this image of a melon, which looks like a carcinome. And again, you ask that question. So if you are likely to see a sign, this is taken as an intuitive supernatural attribution. We also used something which was developed in research on racism and prejudice, which is called an implicit association test. And what this does is to measure reaction times. And so you have to very quickly answer these things. So in this case, we ask people to associate religious images like heaven to either the adjectives real or imaginary. And then we did this in such a way that it was counterintuitive. So we expected that religious people would be slower when they were having their right inferior frontal gyrus stimulated. So, and to go straight into the punchline, we published the results some years after that, where we had this study together with other two studies. And the title of the paper gives you the outcome of the study. So supernatural belief is not modulated by intuitive thinking style or cognitive inhibition. So we found out that although we were able to increase levels of cognitive inhibition by using that stop signal task, which is the standard task to look at cognitive inhibition. So our brain stimulation did that. However, it did not affect in any way the levels of cognitive inhibition of religious belief or supernatural belief. And in the same year, we published this. Will Gervais, who published that paper I mentioned on the association between an analytical thinking style and atheism, or an intuitive thinking style and religiosity, he published a cross-cultural study of this relationship of 13 countries, and he realized that actually he didn't get the expected results. In only 3 of these 13 countries, there was this very small correlation between a more analytical thinking style and atheism, or between an intuitive thinking style or being religious. So he calls his original results and that of other people a culturally weak and fickle phenomenon. And there's now quite a lot of other studies showing that indeed there is either now no significant association between these thinking styles, including intuition and religion. And more recently, and Augustine was also at this conference where we presented some of the main results of the Explaining Atheism project. And similarly, we found out that cognitive inhibition or an intuitive thinking style plays really no role in the making of becoming an atheist or of being a religious person. So we concluded, this is the conclusion from this study. How do supernatural beliefs arise? There is ample evidence that supernatural beliefs play an important function in meaning-making, emotional compensation, and potentially the modulation of physiological responses. They fulfill a need to predict and perceive the world and to reduce uncertainty in the environment by generating ideas about the ultimate structure of the world and how to act in it. But against cognitive science of religion hypothesis, like Justin Barrett's hyperactive agency device, this does not necessarily imply that we are born believers. This is the title of another book by Justin Barrett. This does not imply that we are born believers in the way we inevitably learn the language at an early age. What is actually suggested by the wealth of sociological, historical data, and now sociological data, is that whether one has a strong supernatural belief or not, is primarily based on social and educational factors and not on core cognitive dispositions. So, to finish this talk on the neuroscience of being religious or irreligious, neuroscience findings suggest that religious beliefs are processed by brain regions associated with higher order cognition, such as the reappraisal. So thinking back of that first study, what was happening was that the painful stimulation was being contextualized within a higher order religious belief or experience. So it was being reappraised, reinterpreted. There is a continuous interest in testing cognitive style and its association with religious beliefs, but the correlations are typically very low and moderated by culture and religious affiliation. So the major predictor of being a religious person or not is social learning, specifically whether one's parents and surrounding culture is religious or not. Thank you very much. Let's now move on to Q&A. I will stop sharing.
Yeah, big thank you to Mike for that really exciting and enlightening presentation. I think our students have learned a lot. I had given in my previous presentation some background information about Andrew Newberg, his findings and so on. You have
Yes,
modified them and have built several steps upon that, I would say, and have also corrected and updated their findings as well. I also feel personally thankful to you for the additional information and the latest findings that you are introducing and sharing. Thank you. Big thank you to you, Mike. We will go back to our questions. I think the first question is related to the first presentation. That is from Lawrence Godfrey. Mike, can you see the chat box? So then you can read it directly, or I can read it out for you. This is from Lawrence. In Africa, spiritual experiences are often dismissed by the church, which attributes them to influence of evil spirit. Is there any objective measure for discerning these experiences?
So I'm just wondering what kind of spiritual experiences are you referring to?
Lawrence, would you make an intervention and clarify your point? Mike would appreciate more information on the sort of experiences that are attributed to evil spirits in Africa by church.
Okay, thank you. There have been a couple or a number of Marian apparitions that people have experienced in Africa. I know of one in Burundi, Rwanda, and Togo, Mozambique also. But often the church is very reluctant to comment on such personal experiences of Marian apparitions. So I'm wondering whether there could be a standard by which those apparitions could qualify to be of an objective spiritual experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I can think of one historical example which is similar to what you're talking about. So I come originally from Portugal, and as you know, in the early 20th century there were these Marian apparitions, originally to these illiterate children who were shepherds, and this led to serious questioning by the church authorities, and I mean there were some unusual, now regarded as miraculous occurrences, such as the famous dancing of the sun witnessed by thousands of people, which some psychiatrists call a kind of a collective hallucination, which is interesting because collective hallucination is not something which we can explain psychologically or neuroscientifically. It's just a speculation. But again, that is an example of how the religious establishment, the Catholic Church at the time, it took a while for them to recognize that those were genuine apparitions. And this led now to one of the sanctuaries, which is one of the most visited in Europe. Now, if we can, is there an objective measure for discerning these experiences? I think the straightforward answer would be no, no. I do not think that we have the scientific instruments to make that discernment. So this kind of discerning exercise has to come from within the religious traditions, and different religious traditions would have different, let's say, structures of discernment. Same thing with individual religious experience. So within, say, Buddhism, your spiritual instructor would be able to tell you whether the experiences you are having are experiences which are leading you in the right way to liberating you from the cycle of death or rebirth, or are just reinforcing the structures of the ego and of delusion. Augustine, that is my understanding as an experimental psychologist. I'm not sure if you would be able to come up with any idea of objective scientific measure.
There are no objective scientific measure for that. I know in Lourdes itself there are about 20,000 miracles reported. But over the decades, Church has approved just 60 miracles are authentic.
Yes.
Because
So that's again an interesting example. I actually know the medical doctor who is in charge of the medical bureau of miracles in Lourdes, and I met him when he was giving talks at universities around the world, asking researchers to go there and look at their archive, because they have indeed these thousands of cases and only a few dozen were recognized as miracles.
Mike, maybe we'll need to go a bit quick. We have a number of questions more.
I can read them, yeah.
Oh, please. Okay. From Christopher.
Are good and evil inherently embedded within the brain as natural aspects of its functioning? So both psychologists and neuroscientists would say that good and evil are religious or theological attributions. What there is in our biology are the ability to both feel fear and to exert aggression in response to threat, for example. That we see this in the animal kingdom, and we have this in ourselves as well. Now, whether this allows us to also be cruel, and cruelty would be regarded as some kind of evil, we can say that yes. And so biologically, we have the disposition towards that possibility, the possibility of cruelty, as we have the disposition towards pleasure seeking, and to make pleasure seeking a main goal in our life, in which we would theologically or morally address this as hedonism. So you can say that, yes, I mean, this possibility exists within our biology and within our neural capacity. So your studies compare religious and non-believers. In the USA, we have now a contrast between people who believe in science and those who deny science, such as climate change deniers. Do your studies suggest any correlations? Might this impact the religion-science dialogue? Yes. So there's a different strand of research on conspiracy beliefs. I did a study on this a while back, but there's now a growing literature on this, precisely because it's a growing societal issue. So some of this literature approximates that problem in the sense that intuitive thinking is usually associated with conspiracy theories. So this tends to be a form of thinking which is pre-rational and more intuitive. And I'll give you actually an example of the study we conducted. Do you remember the Da Vinci Code? The Da Vinci Code was a very popular book almost 20 years ago, and then it was made into a film, 2006. Dan Brown is one of these best-selling authors. It's a kind of thriller based on a religious conspiracy theory that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were secretly married and they had children. And there is a secret society, the Zions, the elderly of Zion, I think, who have kept this secret bloody lineage of Jesus and Mary Magdalene secret from the world. And that the Catholic Church has also helped to keep this secret from the popular domain. So we did a study on these kinds of religious beliefs on the Da Vinci Code. And we found the usual thing, which is when you confront people about these beliefs, when you dismantle them, when you ask them to read a historical account of how this doesn't make any sense, people who believe strongly in these conspiracy theories, this would only reinforce their original belief. So it's really not a rational thing. People would cling on to that belief system as a form of feeling more secure. The other thing we found out is that the strongest statistical predictor of believing in Da Vinci Code was having a very poor knowledge of early Christian history. So this shows that factual knowledge is actually a deterrent of conspiracy theories, which tends to be processed in a very intuitive and non-reflective way. So in that sense, this literature on cognitive inhibition or the intuitive system and religion does kind of link with this literature on conspiracy beliefs, yes, but not directly. There's no I'm not aware of brain imaging studies or neuroscience studies on this, but there might be some. I would have to check. Next question by Gerald. Are you familiar with the work of Robert Assagioli in psychosynthesis, which seems to allow a scientific basis for spiritual experience? Yes. He was very popular in the 60s and 70s, even with the transpersonal psychology movement. But I do not know currently, I mean, who are the people still practicing psychosynthesis? So I wouldn't be able to, and how this relates to spiritual experience. It's been a long time since I've read his work, over 20 years. So I wouldn't be able to say what's happened to this movement and how it's associated with spiritual experience. So next question by Reverend Wycliffe Musinga. Why do atheists require evidence for beliefs, but also hold beliefs without physical proof? Yes, that's the irony of life, isn't it? So I was telling you that first study I showed you led me in a different direction to study the beliefs of atheists. And exactly as you're suggesting, atheists hold beliefs also in an intuitive way. Some time ago, I conjectured this hypothesis, which I called the belief replacement hypothesis, in which the idea is that within societies, within cultures, which are structured around theological beliefs, either monotheistic or polytheistic beliefs, societies which are strongly structured around these hierarchical beliefs, the metaphysical beliefs, once you move away from these beliefs, this would intuitively lead to the replacement of the belief in God or gods with another kind of belief. So I gave the example of belief in science for atheists in the UK, but I could give other examples. There's humanists, there's existentialists, there's positivists. Do you remember Auguste Comte, the father of the modern father of sociology and of positivism? Towards the end of his life, he created a church of positivism, which was a church aesthetically modeled after the 19th century Catholic Church, but where the icon of the Virgin Mary was replaced by the goddess humanity, holding the child humanity. And then he had religious ceremonies. There's still one active church of positivism that I found in the very south of Brazil. Some other time I'll have to give a talk about that. It's very, very amusing. We have videos of these ceremonies, and they have their own sign of their triple sign of their belief in order, love, and progress. That's how they do it. That triple sign. So that would be a kind of very clear replacement of religious belief by a similar kind of belief in which you believe in humanity instead of belief in God. So I think you're right that indeed they require evidence in terms of experimental methods, but they hold beliefs in an intuitive way without challenging them. Yeah.
Yeah. Bishop Peter has raised his hand. Bishop Peter, could you articulate your question or comment?
I was wondering, we used the word religious, and I was wondering whether people who are not Christians, they are Africans, Kenyans, and whatever, and according to me, they are religious in their own ways, because you find that they have beliefs in a God, and they have a lot of respect in doing their things, because they believe in God, but they may not be Christians, I wanted to know what our science and religion thinks about that. People can be religious when they are not Christians or these established religions.
Yes. Yes.
Can also be religious. I am thinking about, I baptized my father. He believed in God and believed in a lot of what we teach in Christianity. What do you think? The word religious, is it confined to Christians, and especially in our discussions, Roman Catholics and all that? The other question is apparitions. I have heard the way you have explained about apparitions. I personally, in my village, I am known as a person who saw an apparition of Mary. And the Roman Catholic priests in Kaumoni Parish, when they have visitors from Rome or anywhere, they used to come to my small house at home to see this young man who saw Mary. And he made an altar in his own room. And I became a little bit famous about that. And I also nervous about it, because when I was praying with another brother of mine, the house became bright, and and we thought we saw rosaries all over the walls, and somebody looking like what we see in the mission sisters, So she didn't talk, but there was movements of the rosaries. And when we try to take one of them or any of them, we found that we are only joining our own hands. When you grip one, you find you have gripped the hand of your colleague. So at the end, the explanation to this came to my perception that my priesthood, which I was pressing for that time, my father was refusing me from going to the seminary. And we were praying, we had locked ourselves in that room for some weeks, praying there that my father gives us permission to go to the seminary. Now, at the end, the perception was that I would be a priest eventually, but my priesthood would have difficulties and problems, and would need prayers, and would need the intervention of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And this has been known up to today. People say Kaloki saw Mary, and that's why he became a priest. But then the priesthood, they thought those days, was the celibate priesthood. But I'm a married priest and a bishop. So now explain those two questions. What we say about these things? This was not approved by Rome. No, nobody say approved these apparitions, as you say they were not. But I am here living, and I am witnessing that this is what happened to me and my friend, my brother who passed away later on. You see? But then the Roman.
Yes.
Thank you, Bishop Peter. Since we are already past the time,
Let me
we
hear
will
that.
wind up now. Yeah. Mike, could you give your few comments now? Yeah.
Yes. So I think the most important thing I can say is that this kind of experience is, which might seem supernatural or extraordinary, it's within the majority of pre-industrial cultures, it's perfectly accepted and normal. It's only with the rise of in the Industrial Revolution and science that our societies have become much more closed-minded about the perception of these phenomena. And relating that to your first question, I think you were talking about people who may not be Christian or Muslim, but would be indigenous people from tribal or nomadic cultures, who, although they do not believe in a monotheistic God, they would still be religious in the sense they have religious ceremonies. They do believe that when we die, we become spiritual entities, that we go to a certain world. So yes, absolutely. I've been doing some work with anthropologists and indigenous anthropologists in the Amazon, for example. And what we would call a sense of religiosity or religious experience is much more prevalent in those cultures than in our Christian culture in the West. So the world is indeed full of what we would call supernatural entities and events, and there is no clear boundary between a spirit and nature and humankind, as there is in industrial Western society. The last thought I have in relation to that, are you aware of the movement of inculturation theology, which actually started in Africa and then has been very important also in Latin America with the Vatican II Council? So what is interesting about that move, it changed completely the idea of missions with those peoples. And there was the recognition that their own culture is so embedded within a spiritual life form, including embodying some Christian virtues, much more than industrial Christian countries, that missionaries should learn from them, should learn from these indigenous peoples. So in that sense, I would fully agree that yes, of course, there is religion that moves way beyond the world religions, and the kind of religious experience that you're talking about, like these visions of the Virgin Mary, within those indigenous traditions are much more common, in the sense they're common occurrences that are taken for granted.
Thank you, Mike. Maybe we will pick up the last question from Anju Abraham. I find Anju's hand raised. Anju, could you put your question forward?
Yes. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are fine.
Okay. I'm a physicist and I'm curious to know something related to my background. I'm truly delighted to hear about your research findings and understanding of the mind in this context of studies. My question is, does your view of mind align in any way with quantum understanding of consciousness and proximity of mind and matter? How the mind interact with the physical world at a quantum level?
Yes.
Did you go? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, this
I got
clear.
it.
This clear.
Yeah. What I can tell you is that consciousness is a very poorly studied topic. This might sound like a paradox, given the legion of current neuroscience studies, but we have no common theory of what is consciousness or how it works. We have very small domains of how a perception of something might engage certain areas of the brain and might work at the cognitive level. But we have a variety of theories of how consciousness might work, including some that talk about the quantum mechanics level. But we're talking about speculative hypotheses and theories. For those of you who study science and religion, let me just mention that perhaps the most significant philosophical movement, if you might call it that, that has arose out of, well, David Chalmers is the formulator in the 90s of this, but before him, Thomas Nagel had already spoken about qualia. So the felt qualitative experience of consciousness, which David Chalmers in the 1990s calls the hard problem of consciousness, that all of our neuroscience experiments will not be able to address, will not be able to come down with the structures that explain this, and that consciousness itself should be seen as a fundamental property of the universe alongside, say, time and space. But there was this movement in the 1990s of consciousness studies, but unfortunately, it hasn't really come to fruition. There is really no consensus of how consciousness works. And yes, there are some theories to do with how it might work at the quantum level, but again, we have no consensus.
Thank you, Mike, for the day. We have what is the existence of a creator? Why is the existence of a creator a logical necessity? Wycliffe, we have addressed this question in our philosophical course, especially while dealing with Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. If we can slightly revise our section, otherwise I can give you a response to your question.
I will leave that question for you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So thank you, everyone. Really enjoyed your session, Mike. Me too. I think you provoked the most number of questions and interaction. That is why we went past by about 7 minutes, I think. Thank you for enlightening our group, Mike. Big thank you on behalf of all. We will stay in touch soon.
Keep warm in Oxford. I'll keep enjoying the heat in Kerala.
Okay, wonderful, Mike. Thank you, everyone. God bless.